So just to say that I was yes, I am fairly sort of sure that my favourite poet, when asked, is H Auden. And to prove this, last year was the 50th anniversary of his death, and I decided to go on a little personal pilgrimage, and I took myself off to Austria to visit his grave, which is in this tiny little village called Kirchstetten, which is about an hour's train journey from Vienna. He died in Vienna and had a house in Vienna, and I managed to get hold of a woman who said, "Oh, are you interested in his house?" So I said, "Well, yes, I am." So she said, "Oh, I'll get the key." So she went and toddled off and got the key. And the house that he lived in for many years, actually, for half of the year, is a private house, but they have kept what was his study and another room, which was a bedroom, in memory of Auden. So it's now known as the Auden house. And I thought, oh, this is very nice. I'll just be able to see that. Anyway, she took me in, and nothing has been moved. His slippers are there. His gin bottles are there. His typewriter is there. His books are all there. And hardly anybody knows about this as far as I can see, and they don't really want to rush, I don't think. His car is there, with bullet holes in it. It's an old VW. And a friend of his drove him somewhere and then went off and got in trouble with the police, and apparently there was some little gunshots in it. Completely chaotic. And they've got some videos there of him in the house. And so I had a fantastic time, but I felt it was all a sort of personal treat. And to see his rather grotty slippers, he was a very dishevelled person, particularly towards the end of his life. But he was never known for his tidiness. He was always said to have dirty fingernails. And there's a lovely story of Madame Stravinsky when Auden was living in New York, and we'll talk about that, but when he was living in New York, she went for dinner in his flat with a few other people, and she was really taken aback by how disgusting the flat was and how in need of clean it was. Anyway, she needed to go to the toilet, so she went, and on the toilet was this bowl full of a brown substance. And she thought, oh, she felt sick. And she thought, well, he's not going to deal with it. So she took it and she flushed it down the toilet and cleaned up, and only to discover that that was the chocolate mousse. Which is supposed to be the pudding for the occasion. And that's where he kept it cool. But anyway. So what's often forgotten is Auden was a poet with very strong Christian faith. And he often gets, I think, put in the shade a bit when you start talking of poets of that era with their faith, particularly Eliot. But Auden was a very Christian poet, and he took faith enormously seriously, and he engaged very imaginatively with it. So I thought we'd just look together a little bit of his life again, and a little bit of a few of his poems, and what he made of Christian faith. And as I start, and in fact all the way through this series, I'm very conscious of something he once said. A poem should always be more interesting than anything you can say about it. It's a very good rule, I think, to remember that. Not everyone knows much about H Auden, of course. Strangely, it's his face that is most famous, more famous than his poems in a way. It became very craggy by creasing, very deep creases later in his life. Over the years, that face has been compared to a dry riverbed, an elephant's hide in the mud, and in his own words, a wedding cake that's been left out in the rain. Cecil Beaton captured this transition in Auden from youth to age in some very memorable photographs, which you can look up online now. And Beaton was fascinated by Auden, I think, as a subject. Then, apart from his face, some of his love poetry had a bit of a surge of popularity after the actor John Hannah read his funeral blues in Four Weddings and a Funeral, which, believe it or not, was in 1994. Funeral Blues is actually a cabaret song written by Auden for a play he wrote with Christopher Isherwood called The Ascent of F6, and the music was composed by Benjamin Britten. His poem, September the 1st, 1939, which is in your little booklet, was read publicly at a lot of memorials, particularly in the follow-up to the 9/11 incident in New York, and was read a lot. Actually, there's a slight irony here, later in life, Auden hated that poem, and he actually discarded it from collections of his works. He said it was a dishonest poem. He felt that when he wrote it, he was not being true to his real feelings and beliefs. And so he left it out, but it is a very popular poem, particularly for memorials. He was a poet for whom, when it came to language, truth was always at stake. And self-scrutiny of the first order was essential, so that when he cast away this poem, that's not particularly unusual, he was always revisiting his work, and quite often he started to amend it, and there are lots of crossings out and jottings and revisions of his work, because he was always going back to them and asking if they were indeed honest or resonant. Auden's literary executor and biographer, Edward Mendelssohn, has stated rather boldly that Auden was the first poet writing in English who felt at home in the 20th century. And what I think he means there is that Auden absolutely relished the ideas and the work of novelists and historians and theologians and philosophers and psychologists and anthropologists and the political scientists of his day. He had no great romance about the past. He had no great hatred about the future. He was very much in the present as a poet. And everything is therefore sort of life-sized in his work. He was, I think, probably the first English language poet to be influenced by psychoanalytical theory, Freud, and also by Marxist theories. And I think to read Auden is really then, and his life fits broadly the 20th century, it's to be immersed in a sort of poetic encyclopedia of the 20th century. It's a creative engagement with the history, with the emotions, with the thinking, with the beliefs of that incredible, but also, of course, very fractured and damaged century. The American National Book Committee, which awarded him the National Medal for Literature in 1967, concluded that Auden had, and I quote, illuminated our lives and times with grace, wit, and vitality. His work, branded by the moral and ideological fires of our age, breathes with eloquence, perception, and intellectual power. Well, he was certainly very quick to establish his own distinctive voice as a young man. When he begins writing his poetry at university, he tersely omits definite articles, he compresses the syntax, he inverts the word orders. It makes his early work very breathless, and you get the sense that there's only time to write the words that really matter. And you get a sort of sense that it's sort of a translation from the German. I'll give you an example, one line, in month of August to a cottage coming. You know, that sort of sounds like it's just been literally translated from the German. As he developed over his working life, he became much more versatile and inventive, always keen to understand the workings of the world and, as I say, the inner life, the spiritual truths that might ultimately order, he thought, the patterns of existence. So Mendelssohn, the biographer, says he welcomed into his poetry all the disordered conditions of his time, to perceive human beings as the product of collective, instinctive, and archetypal forces, rather than as individuals who think, choose, and feel. Because of that, some people think that Auden is an anti-romantic, a poet of analytical clarity who sought order and universal patterns in existence. He is considered versatile and inventive, and throughout his career he collaborated with other poets, Christopher Isherwood, Louis MacNeice. He joins with Chester Kallman to create libretti for musical works by Britten, Stravinsky, and therefore he is very creative with others as well. He's not just a solitary individual. He published about 400 poems, including 7 long poems. 2 of those are actually book length. And his poetry ranges in style from, sort of rather obscure modernism to a very lucid traditional form like a ballad or a limerick. Lots and lots of different forms that he's experimenting with. And the tone and the content of these poems is also very versatile. You almost get sort of pop song cliches with complex philosophical meditations. He can be talking about the corns on your toe to the atoms, to the stars, from contemporary crises to the evolution of society. The whole gamut of human experience is there. And working your way through a collection of Auden's work is to feel as if you've landed in this. I don't know if you go to these, I don't know if you go to some old houses, you get this sort of Wunder cabinet, the cabinet that's got all these little extraordinary little things from around the world that show you what a marvellous universe we're in. And I often think actually that opening a book of Auden is a little bit like that. He diagnoses England post-Empire pretty well. He called it "this country where no one is well," he called it. Some very much prefer his early work and his middle work and dislike his later work. That's quite popular in critical works on him. What is undisputed, I think, is that he is one of the most influential and admired Anglo-American, I'll explain that in a second, poets of the last century. And one critic has written that whatever criticism we may make of Auden, he has been there before us and said it of himself, and more cleverly. So we'll look at his life briefly and then at his Christian faith, and en route we'll look at 1 or 2 of his poems. Again, I'm going to use that great prayer, lead us not into interpretation. I want you to make of it what you will. Few things, of course, just to remember when we do look at some of these, and you're going to be working moderately hard tonight with 1 or 2 of them. Remember the democracy of poetry. You can say what you like, you're not going to be wrong. You just got to speak about your response to it. And remember that lovely description of poetry. Poetry is the clear expression of mixed feelings. And I think you sometimes get that in him. But before I look at one of his life, let me just look at one of his poems, which, well, perhaps it's very topical today. Remember that he's writing a lot of his poems in the shadow of the Second World War. And if you turn to the first one on page 2, Refugee Blues. Say this city has 10 million souls. Some are living in mansions, some are living in holes. Yet there's no place for us, my dear. Yet there's no place for us. Once we had a country and we thought it fair. Look in the atlas and you'll find it there. We cannot go there now, my dear. We cannot go there now. In the village churchyard there grows an old yew. Every spring it blossoms anew. Old passports can't do that, my dear. Old passports can't do that. The consul banged the table and said, "If you've got no passport, you're officially dead." But we are still alive, my dear. But we are still alive. Went to a committee. They offered me a chair, asked me politely to return next year. But where shall we go today, my dear? But where shall we go today? Came to a public meeting. The speaker got up and said, "If we let them in, they'll steal our daily bread." He was talking of you and me, my dear. He was talking of you and me. Thought I heard the thunder rumbling in the sky. It was Hitler over Europe saying they must die. Where we were in his mind, my dear, where we were in his mind. Saw a poodle in a jacket fastened with a pin. Saw a door opened and a cat let in. But they weren't German Jews, my dear. But they weren't German Jews. Went down the harbour and stood upon the quay. Saw the fish swimming as if they were free. Only 10 feet away, my dear. Only 10 feet away. Walked through a wood, saw the birds in the trees. They had no politicians and sang at their ease. They weren't the human race, my dear. They weren't the human race. Dreamt I saw a building with 1,000 floors, 1,000 windows and 1,000 doors. Not one of them was ours, my dear. Not one of them was ours. Stood on a great plain in the falling snow. 10,000 soldiers marched to and fro, looking for you and me, my dear. Looking for you and me. Would you just turn to your neighbour for a minute or two and please just talk about the response to that poem, but also ask yourself how Auden has written this poem, what effect the form it has in its conveying of me to people. Spend a couple of minutes together on this poem. Strong conversation going on there, so you obviously had some response to it. Who likes this poem? Who thinks it's effective? Yeah. What are you saying about it, if you feel able to share anything?
Well, it's very moving and how lonely it is. How
Lonely.
lonely in a big city when you're not welcome. Well, it's relevant today as it was describing the 30s, isn't it?
Yeah. What about the form it takes?
Repetition.
Yeah. Is that effective, or is it, yeah. Why do you think it's effective, that sort of repetition?
It passes a rhythm.
Personally?
It's a bit like it has a sort of formulaic pattern, which is a bit like a sort of old country song or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's very kind of musical. And of course, it's a refrain which doubles the phrase, my dear.
Yes.
It could be sung, I suppose.
Yes.
Hence the title. Hence the title.
Yes, blues.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
It also kind of slows you up a bit.
Uh-huh.
So you have to think a bit more about what's going on, because if you don't just go straight on the next line, you have that repetition. Right? You go, okay,
Yeah. And, I mean, in reference to last week, a rather accessible poem. You can, you're in it quite quickly, and you're understanding where it's going, perhaps, more than some that we've looked at in the past.
It's very imaginative, however, because the message is the same in each stanza, but he uses a different image to illustrate the theme. So,
And locates it historically by mentioning Hitler. So it's not left vague.
and the fact that the refugees are German Jews.
Yeah.
No.
Okay, well, I just wanted to It's not a terribly well-known, but did many people know this poem before? No, it's not a very well-known poem, but I'm trying to resuscitate it because I do think it has some resonance today.
When was it written? Do you know?
I think it's early 30s.
Right.
Early 30s, I think so. I can check that when you're having a next natter. I'll look it up. Now, I haven't printed one poem. I just want you to listen to it. I think this is it's a short poem, and I think this is very Auden-esque. Okay, it's a word that got developed, and it has Auden's intrigue into the human condition. There's a very sort of strong observer about Auden, but he loved gossip. Okay? He was a great gossip. And listen to this poem. At last the secret is out, as it always must come in the end. The delicious story is ripe to tell to the intimate friend. Over the teacups and in the square, the tongue has its desire. Still waters run deep, my dear, there's never smoke without fire. Behind the corpse in the reservoir, behind the ghost on the links, behind the lady who dances and the man who madly drinks, under the look of fatigue, the attack of migraine and the sigh, there is always another story. There is more than meets the eye. For the clear voice suddenly singing, high up in the convent wall, the scent of the elder bushes, the sporting prints in the hall, the croquet matches in summer, the handshake, the cough, the kiss. There is always a wicked secret, a private reason for this. And it's a very Auden word. The handshake, the cough, the kiss. It's a very gossipy poem as well, I think. Anyway, Auden was born in York and raised in Birmingham. His father was a very prominent physician with a very extensive knowledge of folklore and mythology. And his mother was a very strict Anglican missionary nurse and very less accepting of her son's ways, even then complaining of his untidiness and eating any food he came across. Auden went to prep school, which he said was ruled by malignant devils. And then he went to public school, to Gresham's in Norfolk, which was reasonably liberal, although he did say later that all he knew about totalitarianism was learned at public school. He was there with Benjamin Britten and Donald Maclean. And it was while he was at school that he begins to write. And there's this famous story that he used to tell, that he went out for a walk in the countryside with a friend as a boy, young boy, and the boy asked him, "Tell me, do you write poetry?" And he said this was one of the moments, such as, when somebody might have said to Shakespeare, "Ever thought about writing a play about a Danish prince?" Auden said that was the moment he knew what he wanted to do. And he was a person of extreme decisions. And a lot of his poetry feels like he's lecturing you. He was very definitive. But if you want to see him in action, you can still get online Parkinson interviewing him. And this was in the days when he's sitting there with his fag, dropping all the ash everywhere, all over him. And you get this real sense of him sort of lecturing Parkinson about life and the universe. His poems can sometimes have that tone. He had a very early interest in science and engineering. He gets to Christ Church, Oxford, and his fascination with poetry leads him to change his field of study from engineering to English, and his attraction to science never really wanes, though, and hence all the scientific references that you do find in his poems. And while he's at Oxford, he becomes familiar with modernist poetry from Eliot. And it was at Oxford that Auden becomes the pivotal member of a group of writers called the Oxford Group, very originally named, or now known as the Auden generation. And this includes people like Stephen Spender, C.J. Lewis, Louis MacNeice. And the group really was adhering to various Marxist and certainly anti-fascist doctrines, and they were addressing all the social, political themes of the day. Somebody said they were sending up the old pieties, as young people often do, if you're lucky. He was the clever undergraduate. He was gay, and very gay, at university. He was the centre of a court of the clever who looked up to him as their leader. And he himself becomes more political after he leaves Oxford. He goes to Berlin. He develops very left-wing views, anti-fascist principles. He goes to Spain, intending to drive an ambulance in the Civil War. I don't know why, because he was a dreadful driver, and it was probably better for them that he never really did any, because he was well known for his chaotic driving. If you see that car in Kirchstetten, you'll see what I mean. He also went to China with Isherwood and to Iceland with MacNeice, so he's doing a bit of travel, and then he creates his first book of poetry, originally called Poems, and privately printed by Stephen Spender, and this is in 1928. And there are lots of influences that you can spot in those early poems, not least, I think, Thomas Hardy. Anyway, Auden's poems from the second half of the 1930s start to reveal more of the political turmoil of the age, and you get one of his most widely anthologized pieces called Spain, which is very much based on his time there in the Civil War. Some critics have suggested that Auden's unusual writing style began in his childhood. Some people think that he sort of kept a sort of childlike approach to his writing, but certainly as he progresses, he is experimenting, and although you get an Auden-esque flavour, you wouldn't necessarily pick up a poem and know it was by Auden, because he does experiment in different ways. He teaches at schools, and he's very good at lecturing people. He leaves England, however, in 1939 with Isherwood, and they become citizens of the United States. So this is just on the eve of the war. This didn't go down very well. Some said he was retreating from the war, that he was being a coward. Those who knew him say that wasn't the case. He did offer, and this is not often said, but he did offer to return. He called the British Embassy and offered himself to go back, and they said to him, "No, thank you, we need skilled people, not a poet." He remembered that. He wanted to earn his living by writing. He thought that this was more achievable in the United States, and it certainly worked. He made poetry pay. And a lot of poets, as you know, have other jobs. So Philip Larkin is working in Hull Library and writing his poems and getting a bit of dosh from that. Auden is a professional poet for his life. He makes his living from writing. And his first book, written in America, contains some of his best-known poems. Among them is September the 1st, 1939, the one he came to dislike. And another one is Musée des Beaux-Arts, which you'll find in here, page 6. I'm going to ask you again, just to turn to your neighbour and see what you make of this poem. About suffering, they were never wrong, the old masters. How well they understood its human position. How it takes place while someone else is eating, or opening a window, or just walking dully along. How when the aged are reverently, passionately waiting for the miraculous birth, there always must be children who did not especially want it to happen. skating on a pond at the edge of the wood. They never forgot that even the dreadful martyrdom must run its course anyhow in a corner, some untidy spot where the dogs go on with their doggy life, and the torturer's horse scratches its innocent behind on a tree. In Bruegel's Icarus, for instance, how everything turns away quite leisurely from the disaster. The ploughman may have heard the splash, the forsaken cry, but for him it was not an important failure. The sun shone as it had to on the white legs disappearing into the green water, and the expensive, delicate ship that must have seen something amazing, a boy falling out of the sky, had somewhere to get to, and sailed calmly on. Just a couple of minutes on that together. See what you make of it. Does anybody like this?
Yes.
Why do you go?
Well, because I never painted Icarus very well, and I love what was written about it. And it's, I think it's just so brilliant because he's brought to life, for me, so many paintings, you know, Mother and Child, Crucifixion, etc. And you look at these Christmas cards or these birthday cards, and you move on, you just move on. And it's also beautifully expressed, so I'm there.
You liked it? Great. Anybody else? What did you make of this? Yeah.
I'm just going to share an anecdote. I used to have a poster of this picture on the wall in my office. And when I left the office, I left the poster absent on the wall. And the next 3 people kept it. They kept this poster and were really moved by the image as well.
I find it a bit hard to get beyond knowing what the paintings are like and thinking how well it sums them up in a beautiful way. But I worry that I should be doing something beyond that, and I'm not.
Yeah. The way he's written it, I think, that the argument is rather casual. He sort of casually, yes, accepted it. Yeah, exactly. Do you want to say a bit more about that?
Well, he manages to conjure up this impression of somebody thinking out loud.
Yeah.
And in fact, although it is very, what's the word I want? It's not dogmatic, he's not preaching.
Yeah.
But he seems to suck you into his story. And I've always loved this poem, and I don't know why, it's much more, well, what I said to my friend here was, it's much more an artifact than a lot of all these poems are.
Yeah, thank you. That's very interesting. One last comment on this poem?
There are a lot of people who really wouldn't see the point of this. First, you have to know this picture.
Yeah.
And secondly, not all those masters are right.
Yeah. Yeah. But he says it's about suffering. At the beginning, about suffering, they were never wrong. And I suppose if you're wanting to come back, so you're looking for a bit of depth to this, substance, what's it about? He's saying it's about suffering at the beginning. But you're saying, oh, you're not difficult with him up. You're sort of saying, is it? Or what's he saying?
I think it's because the pictures knowing the pictures almost gets in the way. You're busy thinking, that sums up the picture beautifully.
Yep.
And don't go a step beyond that, but you just led me a little bit beyond that by what you just said. That it is about suffering and how the rest of the world isn't immediately drawn into one person's suffering, but it's isolated and lonely suffering.
And of course, he calls it the human position, that perhaps we don't see each other suffering, and we just sail on by. but and the doggy life continues, and the torturer's horse scratches its behind, but actually we're talking about suffering. I find it rather haunting. It's written about 1938, this poem, when there was suffering was beginning to hit the news quite a lot. Look at the one afterwards on page 6. The more loving one. Looking up at the stars, I know quite well that for all they care, I can go to hell. But on earth, indifference is the least we have to dread from man or beast. How should we like it were stars to burn with a passion for us we could not return? If equal affection cannot be, let the more loving one be me. Admirer as I think I am of stars that do not give a damn, I cannot, now I see them, say, I missed one terribly all day. Were all stars to disappear or die, I should learn to look at an empty sky and feel its total dark sublime, though this might take me a little time. So Auden, as I say, is very much developing his voice. He's now publishing. He's getting to be quite a famous name. He becomes formidable rather in his poetic technique. He has a very acute ear to words. As I said, he revises his work a lot. And somebody once said, in his verse, Auden can argue, reflect, joke, gossip, sing, analyse, lecture, hector, and simply talk. So you get a lot of this sort of, every time you pick up an Auden poem, you've got a different tone as well as a different form. And somebody, the same woman actually, Barbara Everett, says of him, he can sound at will like a psychologist on a political platform, or like a theologian at a party, or like a geologist in love. I think that's a rather nice description. He carries on writing lots of poems later in life. As I say, some of his poems people don't admire such a lot. But for our purposes, he converts to Christianity, or shall I say he reconverts to Christianity. You know, the sense that the hardest conversion is that of the converted. He starts to take Christianity much more seriously. He'd read a lot of theology, and he returns to Christianity, and he returns to a very Anglo-Catholic form of Christian faith. He, as I said, lived in a bit of a mess. Eventually he returns to England. He was given a cottage in the gardens of Christ Church in Oxford, and was professor of poetry at Oxford. But by then he was a very lonely figure. I think, maybe some of you know, I think he preached here.
He did.
So he did talk in later life about his Christian faith quite openly. We'll talk about his faith in a second. But he was a lonely figure, and towards the end of his life was seen by students very much sitting lonely in cafes, always in the carpet slippers, covered in stains and cigarette ash. He was well known, however, even though he was a sort of, it's W.H. Auden, he was very well known for his kindness that he showed particularly to young writers, to prisoners. He would often write to prisoners. If you wrote to him admiring his work, you'd often get a very long and thorough reply. He dies in a hotel room in Vienna. He'd given a poetry reading and stays in a hotel before going back to his house in Kirchstetten. He had this house in Austria, and he dies. And he's buried, as I said, in Kirchstetten. And if any of you are interested, I can show you pictures on my phone of his grave, which just says W.H. Auden, Man of Letters. It's very simple, and that's where he wanted to be buried. And the woman, I haven't told you this, the woman who got the key for me to go into his house told me, just as she was taking me back to the station, she said, "Oh, I forgot to tell you," she said, "I sang in the choir at his funeral." Rather beautiful little connection with him. Since his death, 1973, lots of re-evaluation of him, lots of PhDs on H Auden, as to how good he is, how his work develops, and all those sort of things. If you want a very simple, accessible introduction to Auden, there's a small book by Alexander McCall Smith, who wrote, what did he write? Yes, that's right. The Botswana, yeah. He adores Auden, and some publisher asked him to write a little sort of book saying why, and it's really very accessible and a very good introduction, and it's very enthusiastic and a bit hagiographical, but it's fun. And when he's looked at Auden's life, he says this: "These are the simple, stripped-down facts. They conceal so much, an immensely complex body of work in which there are layers of meaning and reference that could take a lifetime to understand. A noble and generous heart, a courteous and urbane citizen of a troubled century, a man who somehow seems to speak personally to his reader. They conceal a person who might be the best of guides to the inescapable task of being human, who might, if we allow him, really change our lives." Rather, he's full into H Auden. Some people think that there is the capturing of Auden, often in a phrase or two, that really pierces. And one of the critics says, when he first read Auden, he said, "I read, I shuddered, and I knew." There's something occasionally where when he strikes gold, he really does strike gold. Let's just, before I just tell you a little bit more about his faith, let's just look at one of the poems about religion. And I'm going to choose one that those of you who are musicians, and there are one or two here, will know the 12. The 12 is sung as an anthem. Was it sung at the Abbey very often, the 12? Lots, yes. My last job was at St John's College, Cambridge. We sang this a lot. So it's written to be sung, this. And it's about the 12 apostles. So it's often sung on the feast of an apostle. And it's in sections. And quite often it's not read like we're just going to do, because people only hear it to music. But I thought we might just look at it. So remember, it's about the 12 apostles being sent out. Without arms or charm of culture, persons of no importance, from an unimportant province, they did as the Spirit bid, went forth into a joyless world of swords and rhetoric to bring it joy. When they heard the word, some demurred, some mocked, some were shocked, but many were stirred and the word spread. Lives long dead were quickened to life, the sick were healed by the truth revealed, released into peace from the gin of old sin. Men forgot themselves in the glory of the story told by the 12. Then the Dark Lord, adored by this world, perceived the threat of the light to his might. From his throne he spoke to his own. The loud crowd, the sedate engines of state, were moved by his will to kill. It was done. One by one, they were caught, tortured, and slain. O Lord, my God, though I forsake thee, forsake me not, but guide me as I walk through the valley of mistrust, and let the cry of my disbelieving absence come unto thee, thou who declared unto Moses, I shall be there. Children play about the ancestral graves, for the dead no longer walk. Excellent still in their splendour are the antique statues that can do neither good nor evil. Beautiful still are the starry heavens, but our fate is not written there. Holy still is speech, but there is no sacred tongue. The truth may be told in all. 12, as the winds and the months, are those who taught us these things. Envisaging each in an oval glory, let us praise Him with a merry noise. Yes, Mary, Mary. I mean, remember that this was set to music, and so that second you can hear lots of repetition, bid, and lots of rhyming. Do you get a sense that this is written by somebody who believes it, rather than just commissioned to write it?
Oh, yes.
Yes, I think you get that sense, I think, from Auden. That when he writes about religion, you do feel that he's immersed in it. He's not just an observer to it. Anyway, again, that's not always very well known, the 12, but unless you're a musician, or you go to evensong every night, or all the above. So let me just tell you a little bit about his Christianity. Both Auden's grandfathers were clergy, and Auden's last poems were haikus. The very last poems he wrote were haikus that described or took the form of prayer. One says, this is one of the haikus, his thoughts pottered from verses to sex to God without punctuation. I think that's quite a good summary of old Auden, really. Pottered from verses to sex to God without punctuation. There's a sort of rounded integrity about his Christian writing, I think. Another late haiku that he wrote just says, he has never seen God, but once or twice he believes he has heard him. As I mentioned, the conversation as a boy that led him to write poetry, it was in the same conversation that it actually focused on religion. And although he lost his faith around 1922, he's coming back to it in around 1940, and he's returning to the liturgy and the faith of his mother. And Christianity becomes a very governing subject in a lot of his long poems. It underlies a lot of the shorter poems too. He wrote many essays, not just poems, on religion. If you're interested in theologians, who's he reading? Who does he really respond to? St. Paul, Pascal, Kierkegaard, Buber, Tillich, Niebuhr, and many others. He was very well read. So his faith can't really be exaggerated, but it does pose a few difficulties. He objected to analytical explanations of his own or anyone else's belief, and he didn't like most Christian apologetics. He didn't like it when people tried to spell out rationally, analytically, what belief is. He's a poet, after all, and resists this sort of thing. Theology and Christian philosophy are written by and for believers, he says. Persons, that is, to whom God is already a subject of prayer, even if only subconsciously. So he doesn't like sort of abstract talk of God. He had a very liberal use of Christian terms. One friend said the more pious were shocked because it was like he was wearing his Sunday best on weekdays. And they wondered quite often where he stood on religious matters. Actually somebody said, well, he never stood anywhere, he only ever sat. His own answer was this: I think I'm an Augustinian, not Thomist. I would allow a little more room for the via negativa. Liturgically, I am Anglo-Catholic, though not too spiky, I hope. As to forms of church organisation, I don't know what to think. I'm inclined to think that it will be back to the catacombs for all of us. As to organisations, none of the churches look too hot, do they? but what organisation does. One of my favourite comments of his, he said that in each of us there's a bit of a Catholic and a bit of a Protestant, because, he said, truth is Catholic, but the search for it is Protestant. So he said, we're all a bit of both. Truth is Catholic, but the search for it is Protestant. And it's very true, I think, that he did have this strong sense of the via negativa, the idea that, you know, everything you say you have to unsay because you're talking about God. And as Rowan Williams says, at the end of the day, theology is the business of trying to say the least stupid thing we can about God. And I think Auden had a very strong sense of that. He also says that, and I think I put it on the front of your sheet here, he didn't like the idea that everybody could just very nonchalantly say, oh yes, I'm a Christian. He would often say, do you know what you're saying? And he used to say, you can't really say I'm a Christian. You can only really say at the end of the day, I want to be a Christian. I'm trying to be a Christian. It was an aspiration for him. And you'll see it here. Those of us who have the nerve to call ourselves Christians will do well to be extremely reticent on the subject. Indeed, it is almost a definition of a Christian that he's somebody who knows he isn't one, either in faith or morals. And you do get that very strong sense that he didn't like cheap talk about his faith. There are others, of course, who take very much that similar view. I think Maya Angelou once said, she said, you know, when people say to me, I'm a Christian, I want to say to them, what, already? So, really? You've got a bit more work to do on being a Christian. He believed that prayer was paying attention, but also with a sense of listening to someone, that it isn't just a sort of observational attention, but that actually you're trying to capture the echoes of a source. And so he does talk quite openly about prayer and about spirituality. And somebody said, Auden prayed to a God whom he knew he thought about in falsely human-centered terms, but only by doing so could he listen with any attention. So he knows that his words aren't adequate, but I do think there is deep down in all this a very strong sense that although our words don't add up, they don't add up because there is a reality. This is not just a relativistic, non-realist type faith. He did believe in the reality of God. He just felt that everything we try to say about that reality ends up feeling not very real. And there is a strong sense in his poems that actually at the end of the day, what you're called to as a Christian is love. And love, as you saw in this poem about, you know, let the more loving one be me. I think he really tried to do that as a response to his faith. He also tries to do it, and I haven't talked about this, but he also tried to do it in his personal life with Chester Kalman, who becomes his life partner. But it was a life partner who had, you know, a lot of other partners, and, you know, Knightley, and was not offering the fidelity really to Auden that Auden craved, I think. And Auden loved him very much and tried to just cope with it somehow and survive it. But you always get it, even in that relationship, which was pretty bonded. And I watched a video when I was in Kishtet of the funeral. And there is Kalman, you know, looking absolutely distraught. And by then he was drinking a lot as well. But I think even in his one sort of long-term partnership, there was a sense in which he was also trying to be the one who loves more. Let the more loving one be me. And there is a sort of wistfulness about that, I think, which you detect in some of the poems. In the little selection I've given you, I've given you a poem called Friday's Child. I'm not going to read that one tonight. I think you need to go home with this one. But he wrote this in memory of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was martyred, as you know, by the Nazis in 1945 for being part of a plot to assassinate Hitler, which didn't work. But that was Friday's child, meaning, of course, Christ who died on the cross on a Friday. But this is, I put that there because I think you need to spend time with that yourself to look at. But I want to look in memory of W.B. Yeats, part 3, on page 10. Earth, this is W.B. Yeats dies, and Auden is moved by this and writes, and this is part 3 of the longer poem. Earth received an honoured guest. William Yeats is laid to rest. Let the Irish vessel lie, empty of its poetry. In the nightmare of the dark, all the dogs of Europe bark, and the living nations wait, each sequestered in its hate. Intellectual disgrace stares from every human face, and the seas of pity lie locked and frozen in each eye. Follow, poet, follow right to the bottom of the night. With your unconstraining voice, still persuade us to rejoice. With the farming of a verse, make a vineyard of the curse. Sing of human unsuccess in a rapture of distress. In the deserts of the heart, let the healing fountain start. In the prison of his days, teach the freeman how to praise. If you visit his plaque in Westminster Abbey, you will find that H Auden, and you find that in the prison of his days, teach the freeman how to praise. I think you get a very strong sense in this poem exactly what he felt not only his poetry was being called to do in the darkness of his times, but also what his faith was being called to do as well. I think you get in this poem a nice overlap of both. And on page 11, you'll see, again, from a longer poem called For the Time Being, he is the way, follow him through the land of unlikeness. You will see rare beasts and have unique adventures. He is the truth. Seek him in the kingdom of anxiety. You will come to a great city that has expected your return for years. He is the life. Love him in the world of the flesh, and at your marriage all its occasions shall dance for joy. Again, I think a very strong sense of belief that he had, and not sort of writing about other people's belief, but very much his own. So I bring Auden to you in this session because I do actually think that he's often overlooked by Christians and is forgotten as a Christian poet. They tend to focus on his wartime poetry, or they focus on his sexuality, so he becomes a sort of gay poet. But actually, he is very much, I think, a poet of faith. If you want to dive deeper into Auden, there are two pretty long biographies called Early Auden and Late Auden, which are marvellous. But and if you want to look a little bit deeper into some of the poems, the best commentary, I think, is this John Fuller. Again, what a wonderful picture of his face on this book, called W.H. Auden, A Commentary. And he looks at a lot of the 400 poems and tries to give you his own sort of commentary on it. But this is, if you're interested in Auden, this is quite an important book to look at. What I'm going to do to end is read you the poem he didn't like. And we won't talk about it. I just want you to, I'm just going to end with it, and you're going to sort of ruminate on it as you go home, and as you make your cocktail tonight, or your Lenten hot chocolate, or whatever it is. and see what you make of it. But he's writing this on the edge of war. September the 1st, 1939, page 3. I sit in one of the dinings on 52nd Street, uncertain and afraid, as the clever hopes expire of a low, dishonest decade. Waves of anger and fear circulate over the bright and darkened lands of the earth, obsessing our private lives. The unmentionable odour of death offends the September night. Accurate scholarship can unearth the whole offence, from Luther until now, that has driven a culture mad. Find what occurred at Linz, what huge imago made a psychopathic god. I and the public know what all school children learn. Those to whom evil is done do evil in return. Exiled Thucydides knew all that a speech can say about democracy. And what dictators do, the elderly rubbish they talk to an apophatic grave. Analysed all in his book, the Enlightenment driven away, the habit-forming pain, mismanagement and grief. We must suffer them all again. Into this neutral air, where blind skyscrapers use their full height to proclaim the strength of collective man, each language pours its vain competitive excuse. But who can live for long in an euphoric dream? Out of the mirror they stare imperialism's face and the international wrong. Faces along the bar cling to their average day. The lights must never go out, the music must always play. All the conventions conspire to make this fort assume the furniture of home, lest we should see where we are, lost in a haunted wood, children afraid of the night, who have never been happy or good. The windiest militant trash important person shout is not so crude as our wish. What man Nijinsky wrote about Diaghilev is true of the normal heart. For the error bred in the bone of each woman and each man craves what it cannot have, not universal love, but to be loved alone. From the conservative dark into the ethical light, the dense commuters come, repeating their morning vow. I will be true to the wife, I'll concentrate more on my work, and helpless governors wait to resume their compulsory gain. Who can release them now? Who can reach the dead? Who can speak for the dumb? All I have is a voice to undo the folded lie, the romantic lie in the brain of the sensual man in the street, and the lie of authority whose buildings grope the sky. There is no such thing as the state, and no one exists alone. Hunger allows no choice to the citizen or the police. We must love one another or die. Defenceless under the night, our world in stupor lies. Yet dotted everywhere, ironic points of light flash out wherever the just exchange their messages. May I, composed like them of Eros and of dust, beleaguered by the same negation and despair, show an affirming flame. I'll leave it with you to know whether that's still a poem for our time. Thank you very much.